Hello, Trash Future listeners. Nate here. Just a quick heads up. This episode is part one of a two-part series in which we read The Victorians by Jacob Rees-Mogg and react to it with the pleasant company of Nish Kumar. This episode was originally on Patreon. It's now completely unlocked. And if you want part two, it's been released on Patreon today as well. There's a link in the show notes where you can access it. Patreon subscribers, do not worry. There is another bonus coming out on Thursday as well. So you will have all your content needs met. Hopefully you are not currently under lockdown, but apparently that's the fate that awaits us all. Anyway, hope you enjoy.
Hello and welcome to this bonus episode of Trash Future featuring myself, Riley, Milo.
Hello.
Nate on the boards.
Hello.
Alice calling in from sunny Glasgow.
Hello, Riley. You didn't do the sexy voice you always do when there's a bonus episode.
And we are also joined by the official Trash Future Bad Books by Tory MPs correspondent, Nish Kumar.
What a specific brief. I'm honoured to have finally got a real job. Can't wait to tell my parents about this.
Yeah.
You'll never believe it. I've got a real job, and it's listening to the worst writing imaginable.
So
I said this to you before we started recording. Whatever information it is you people are trying to torture out of me, I will give it to you.
It's a bit like when you're watching a BBC News report and they're like, now over to our Bulgaria correspondent, and you can see how genuinely shocked they are to be on TV. Like there's this person like in the very depths of the BBC machine who's like never been used in a report since 1982, and they're like frantically straightening their tie. Oh, yes, Bulgaria. I've not spoken English in 23 years.
So, having gone through the sort of various psychoses and mental cul-de-sacs of our Prime Minister Boris Johnson, we figured it was time to go through the various psychoses and mental cul-de-sacs of the old-fashioned ghost that haunts our Prime Minister, Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Another extremely normal man.
One of the normalest.
The living incarnation of the worst aspects of this entire country. Like, it's like somebody brought to life the worst of our national subconscious.
And what always strikes me, and this is something we'll get into as we go, is that lots of people like to say, oh, he's not even a real toff. And it's like, he's new money. Yeah.
Is he new money?
Yeah, he's a hedge fund. He's a hedge fund guy.
Do you guys know that he was interviewed by Ali G in the late 90s for the 11 o'clock show? Yeah, he was like the poshness expert for, he was like, you know, when Ali G used to do segments on the 11 o'clock show, one of the he used to interview people and say that he was from a fake youth TV show. And one of the people they got was Jacob Rees-Mogg, because he was like seen as like an expert on cartoon poshness in Britain.
Yeah. He's an expert on it because he's very studied at it. And there are lots of liberals who like to own him on the basis of, you just play an aristocrat. You're not really one. You're just a much more modern, important, and effective type of aristocrat, a hedge fund guy.
How many boys have you even molested? Come on.
It's like, have you ever seen The Talented Mr. Ripley? Like, it's trying to own fucking Matt Damon with, you're too successful.
Yeah, exactly. And this is what we're going to be exploring as we go through his book on the Victorians.
The Talented Mr. Rees-Mogg.
And this book, I believe it has been read under 1,000 times.
No, that's under 1,000 sales. It's been read far less times than that.
Far less times than that.
So I am now, I believe, one of a very elite confraternity of people who have read Jacob Rees-Mogg's book. And
it's like those scholars who've memorized the entire Quran. You're like part of a smaller and much dumber subset.
I'll say half is Riley, exactly.
And I have read all of Jacob Rees-Mogg's book, and now I'm taking it out on Nish Kumar.
Just George C. Scott as Patton with Rommel. You've read his goddamn book.
So we're gonna jump right in. The blurb from the publisher is as follows. They built a nation. Starting very strong.
A great start. There was no nation before that.
Killed Nish in the first 5 minutes.
It's already a bad start.
They built a nation. Here's about it's about to get worse. Now it's our turn.
What?
Oh.
Wait.
Here's
Does
one
that
I made
even
earlier.
mean?
The Victorians built this community center and the mean developers want to repossess it. But if we can just put on a show...
Roger Scruton.
Is the twist end that we recolonize India?
I mean,
damn.
I don't know what the twist ending is. I think the twist will come to what that is.
The prize in the colonizing India competition is exactly the same as the cost of stopping them demolishing the new rec center.
So many associate the Victorian era with austere social attitudes and filthy factories.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, fair.
Yep, sounds about
Not the
right.
sort of filth I associate with Victorians, but carry on.
Yeah.
But in this bold and provocative book, I mean, that's true. It is
Yep.
bold and provocative in the sense that it's a 600-page history book with like 50 sources, all of which are just sort of paraphrased into 12 biographies.
It's freeform. He's doing
Yes.
freestyle history.
Jazz history.
Yeah.
I miss the days when provoke didn't mean I'm going to be a cunt for a bit.
Well, I mean, because legitimately, it's a guy whose qualifications as a historian are, I'm the monocle-wearing version of the guy who posts on YouTube videos like, I was born in the wrong era. This is when music was real.
I
Yeah,
see
he's
far
like
older
Mr.
than
Peanut
I am.
after he died.
That's the thing. Nate, this is exactly right. This is like getting the 13-year-old kid who's like, I listen to Led Zeppelin, all my classmates like swag shit. This is like getting that kid to write a history of classic rock based on what he thinks it would have been like.
I mean, yeah, fair. Also, I don't know if you've ever seen Jacob Rees-Mogg as a 13-year-old,
Yes.
but he was
Yes.
famously photographed for the BBC wearing a monocle
Yeah.
and like a double-breasted suit coat at age 13.
So-
it was grim.
Jacob Rees-Mogg, the titular Mogg, leading Tory MP and prominent Brexit advocate, takes up the story of 12 landmark figures to paint a very different picture of the age, one of bright ambition, bold self-belief, and determined industriousness.
How
So,
do
you
you
know,
paint a whole picture with just using white?
also, like, as though that somehow is... that is...
My bad. Sorry.
Sorry.
I wanted to bring this up to show Jacob Rees-Mogg because this was also
Oh, yes, I can see
in
the picture of him, yeah.
1981. Like, he's not even that old.
Yeah. So, to paint a very different picture of the age, one of bright ambition, bold self-belief, and determined industriousness, which, as we all know, is the opposite of austere social attitudes and filthy factories.
Yeah.
It's not like these things can coexist or enable one another or anything. Nope, it's one or the other.
And also, it's like, it's not as though that's not a picture of the Victorians which you're completely fed in school, of like just men in stovepipe hats who wanted to change the British economy
Railroads. They
with
wanted
this
to build
one weird
railroads.
trick, slavery.
Yeah. They were all, that is all we were ever taught. They built bridges and nothing else. Don't Google them.
Yeah, don't
Do
do that.
not Google them.
Whether through Peel's commitment to building free trade, Palmerston's deft diplomacy in international affairs, or Pugin's uplifting architectural feats, the Victorians transformed the nation and established Britain as a preeminent global force.
There's a weird kind of alliteration or assonance in all of those sentences that's annoying the hell out of me.
Death to
Like, it's just-
diplomacy, yeah.
Like, yeah, it's just, it sounds like death to diplomacy. And I was like, hell yeah, I can get behind that. But no, it wasn't
Also,
that.
diplomacy was so fucking easy in the 19th century because it was just a bunch of people meeting up to discuss how the various paws were doing and how
Yes.
best to kill them.
Yeah, you just like drove a boat onto somebody's lawn, like informed them that their land was now your land, and took a piss in a plant.
Yeah, also, far be it from me to speak for the colonies, but to what extent is diplomacy, we will own you through a string of complicated trade agreements? Like that, it doesn't strike me as being particularly diplomatic.
Well, no, they did it because they did it in a smoky back room,
Yeah.
as opposed to in all of these austere European chambers. Anyway, so we don't want to go through every ludicrous piece of historical revisionism in this book because it's basically all historical revisionism. It's all just Jacob Rees-Mogg saying, oh man, why are you being so mean to all these generals and prime ministers? Why won't someone think of the generals and prime ministers?
Every chapter is a book report, but the only discussion is the vibes of that book that he read.
Yes. Again, I've read this book, and yes, among his heroes, he counts as General Charles Napier, who like committed like a massive like colonial massacre in India, and this is monocle into soup shit for the liberal
But he did it in a
commentariat.
cool way.
Yeah.
What I mean is, this is monocle into soup shit for the liberal commentariat because he'll like get some stuff wrong, but none of us are surprised by this kind of shit from Jacob Rees-Mogg. And to be honest, it would be weirder to us if he didn't bow down in worship to erase the crimes of Britain's greatest bloodletters.
Yeah.
So our approach to understanding this book is, as ever, complicated. It seems as though Rees-Mogg had several motivations for writing this piece. Firstly, as a piece of extremely revisionist history to support his view of what Britain should be now and in the future. Secondly, as a piece of myth-making about himself as a kind of Oxonian polymath and traditional gentleman. And third, to carry out an incredibly weird and specific grudge against early 20th century Bloomsbury Group author Lytton Strachey for writing a book called Eminent Victorians, remembered as a brilliant and sardonic bit of history, but also sensitive and honest. And for Rees-Mogg, it was insufficiently fawning, and so he's constantly referenced.
He's just written this book to just, like, fuck this one guy in particular.
Imagine having a beef with someone who died 100 years ago.
but to Jacob Rees-Mogg, that's now. like he wishes it was 100 years ago, and he tries to live in that headspace.
And that's what we're going to get to, actually, is the real reason he wrote it, we, as ever, think is fundamentally personal. Because Jacob Rees-Mogg was raised by Jacob Rees-Mogg's dad, I think William, and William Rees-Mogg is editor of the Times. I'm just going to look that up.
He was William Rees-Mogg, and he was editor of the Times. Can't confirm.
He was editor of the Times, and he was also like an ideological anarcho-capitalist, which again should surprise no one. But he would write books like called Blood in the Streets and stuff about how how investment has to go to crush worker power to make it all of society must be winner take all. These kinds of things like
Rothbard shit, child markets.
Yeah, a manual on how to be a sociopath.
Which, these guys knew something about, so it's all to the good.
And so what we get then is, I think that one of the reasons that Jacob Rees-Mogg is so obsessed with this era is that he is a fundamentally empty person, and this drive to sort of restore nationalism, to restore this drive to nostalgia, is for him to connect with something outside of himself that isn't being bought or sold.
This is the thing. I love this shit. I absolutely love this psychoanalyzing why he's done the worst book of all time. I absolutely love it. Why has this happened?
I blame the public schools. There is nothing as psychotic as an institution as the British public school. Nothing breaks your brain in quite the same way as sort of flouncing around in an outfit designed by an eccentric 16th century pedophile and learning Latin, and it all being for an empire that means nothing anymore and has long since died.
Hey, Alice. We still got Gibraltar and the Pitcairn Islands, okay? Yeah. So let's all just think carefully before we start saying there's Tristan no empire. Okay?
I love Pitcairn Incest Island. It's great. To be fair, we did almost manage from your dad to gather enough money to restore the bell for Brexit. It wasn't quite enough, but I think we can all agree that fucking Spain would have had a bit more trouble doing that.
I'm just laughing at the idea that Jacob Rees-Mogg was probably like a secret contestant on the 1900s house, and much like somebody surfacing too fast from a dive, he got the bends, but it's just like he got dropped back into society with no reintegration, and now he just thinks everything is the year 1900.
It's Goodbye Lenin, but arranged by an entire country. So I want to take a brief detour before we start Jacob Rees-Mogg's book into the preface and most famous passage of the 1918 edition of Strachey's Eminent Victorians. By way of contrast, the history of the Victorian age will never be written, for we know too much about it.
What a line! That's a good line, and we're never going to see that after we do this paragraph.
For ignorance is the first requisite of the historian. Ignorance which simplifies and clarifies, which selects and omits, with a placid perfection unattainable by the highest art. It is not by the direct method of a scrupulous narration that the explorer of the past can hope to depict that singular epoch. If he is wise, he will adopt a subtler strategy. He will attack the subject in unexpected places. He will fall upon the flank or the rear, or will shoot a sudden revealing searchlight into obscure recesses hitherto undivined. He will row out of that great ocean of material and lower down into it here and there a little bucket, which will bring up to the light of day some characteristic specimen from these far depths to be examined with a careful curiosity.
That's beautiful. That's a delightful view of the historian's task, and we're never going to we're stuck with Jacob Rees-Mogg for an hour. You have shown us this light and then snatched it away.
The writing of someone who isn't still breastfed.
So in the spirit of Strachey, this episode will not be about, like I said, the historical ignorance of Jacob Rees-Mogg that has been exposed by legions of liberal journalists and has amounted to nothing, but instead about insights into the man himself, this spiritual deadness and the frantic need to construct an anachronistic persona for himself himself in place of anything inside. These will be the little buckets that we examine with a careful curiosity on the sea that is Jacob Rees-Mogg.
We are rowing out over his ignorance and lowering down buckets to bring up some anglerfish.
I really want Michael Winterbottom to buy the rights to this book and adapt it like a cock and bull story and make it into a movie about Jacob Rees-Mogg trying to jerk himself off to his own price.
Copyright, TM, copyright. Yeah. It's IP, that's Trash Future IP.
Yeah. It's like a weird, Charlie Kaufman movie about Jacob Rees-Mogg trying to write his book about the Victorians.
Incredible. So, because that's not yet been made, the best we have is this podcast. So we're going to start. This is from the introduction, and this is On Duty. Victorian religiosity connected with a more general belief in duty, a belief that encompassed those who were not especially religious. The slaughter of the First World War made duty an unfashionable concept to later generations, but surely a true patriot must value dutifulness above other virtues.
So the First World War was bad, but let's pretend it didn't happen.
Yeah. Let's assume that's just table stakes. If you believe in being dutiful, well, you've got to accept the sum. I'm sorry, lads. Those are the rules. Oh, you don't like getting machine gunned because you've accidentally charged from the wrong trench? Well, sorry to say, boy, but that's what's called being cool.
Also, I don't wish to do this too often, but to remind people of the previous thing where the Boris Johnson novel. It's very clear immediately we are dealing with another first draft. We are absolutely dealing with...
We will see more evidence of that as we go on.
That sentence was like trying to solve a magic eye picture. It was like you're just trying to hold on to that idea that there's some meaning within it.
So contradicts himself in 2 clauses.
Yeah. But also, it's important to note that there's a reason why these books are all released as first drafts, because they're not designed to be read.
Yeah. Of course.
It's like the Juche library approach to history. It's like, the point is to have a huge book on the shelf. It doesn't have to say anything. It just has to be big and be printed. But also, I love this as a side detail. We've delayed this episode until we could get an ebook of this, because the only other version I could find before recently was the audiobook version that Jacob Rees-Mogg himself narrated. And I would not subject Riley to 16 hours of that man's voice.
No.
I just, further to our general point of Britain in 2020 being the Soviet Union, but shit and expensive, we have a shit and expensive version of the Great Soviet Encyclopedia, where it is just like a bunch of one-note biographies stamped together into an enormous volume.
So here's another little tasty morsel for you all. The Victorians had confidence in their civilizing effort, a belief in the goodness of their own nation, and the drive necessary to finish the job. So he's writing a cover letter on behalf of the Victorians for their first, grad scheme.
To finish the job.
Ooh, civilizing effort hit me ancestrally. I just felt a pain
right in the lineage
go
there,
through, go through 3 generations.
Sorry. Also, Lawrence Fox is here to argue that this is good. We're the BBC now.
Yeah. I'm sorry, Nish, you're actually triggered.
I was going to think about the courage to finish the job. It's like three successive invasions of Afghanistan later. It's like, did you really?
Also, everybody ask me if he ever defines what the job is that they're finishing.
Does he ever define
it?
If it was killing a bunch of them,
it's he's referring to a general sense of stick-to-itiveness that appears to,
So this is, we said earlier, not to toot my own horn, but it's the vibes history.
Yes, it's a vibes history.
Did they or did they not finish the spinning jenny? So answer me that.
Why do the kids these days have, invent new genders instead of invading the Sudan?
So here's another one, and this is his main thesis. This is what he's arguing. How favorably this compares with the contemporary nervousness about the country where moral relativism accepts an equivalence between good and bad.
Did you just say the thing I just said, but worse written?
Wait, hang on. A contemporary nervousness about Britain, born out from knowing about Britain.
And also a contemporary nervousness that hasn't translated into anything political at all.
No, I don't know what election results. I don't know what election results he's been reading, but if anything, we could do with a bit more nervousness.
He was allowed to write this book.
Also, here's the thing. It says, that the country now has moral relativism, which accepts there's an equivalence between good and bad. So his main thesis is that in the Victorian times, we thought good things were good and bad things were bad. But in modernity, we think good things are bad and bad things are good. We should go back to how it was.
Isn't this basically the same as that article we read where someone said that people were happier during the Victorian era because there was more joy expressed in newspapers?
More happy words.
It's just like, funny how that works. Yeah.
Yeah. But also, like, good and bad are not easily defined concepts in terms of academic history writing.
I just like the idea that the Victorians as a thing were like uncontroversial in their own day. Like, there were no suffragettes. Marx was not alive. None of this stuff was ever like criticized or questioned because they all stuck to it too fucking much.
Oh, so I'm really excited
drinking
by
soy.
I'm really excited to get to the graphs section in the middle of the book where it's like usages of the word tally-ho. Just like decline steadily through to like 1950 or whatever.
So, Alice, to speak to your point there, these people are never mentioned because either they're enemies of good things and they like bad things like Marx, or they're people who like good things who merely had a misunderstanding with other people who like good things like the suffragettes. And it was in fact the spirit of liberalism that existed during the Victorian era that would have allowed the suffragettes to have the votes eventually.
Wow, yes, okay.
That's kind of how he squares all those circles.
Yeah. There just wasn't enough Victorian time. If Queen Victoria had lived longer,
women would have more votes.
Right,
yeah, exactly. Yeah,
but this is also where I get back to that sense of emptiness, because if you think about this, he's talking about a sense of comradeship and national purpose based around just feeling good about one another. These things that give me a feeling of personal connection and purpose.
Goop side of fascism.
So I'm going to get through more of this. The work ethic of our forebears is also deeply admirable. It is not that people are lazier today, rather that leisure has come to be seen as a right rather than as a reward for work. You know, leisure, like the weekend, like the thing that trade unionists fought for as a right to leisure.
Just because they existed in Victorian times and effected political change on them doesn't mean they were Victorians.
No, that was not. No, the weekend is not a Victorian concept. It's actually a postmodern concept that came earlier.
Yeah, because like all of those existed like entirely outside Victorianness because they were doing Antifa shit.
So, this is where we today can and must learn from our ancestors, he says. After all, is it not still true that the British Constitution is a model that works better than those in other nations?
No.
Define other nations.
No, define better.
Yeah.
Define the British Constitution.
I don't think we even need to do any of that. We don't need to like do any of this Dyson framework stuff. We can just say no. Like, even if we accept every single part of your thesis here, we can just answer the question with no. No, it doesn't. By your own logic, no.
By the British Constitution, what he actually means is the ability to endlessly eat boiled, unseasoned meat and not die.
So he goes on, that is why the British Constitution has been so widely copied. That's why.
You know that
sure is why.
It just was naturally occurring. It fell like rain from the heavens.
He does define the British Constitution. He says democracy, the rule of law, the rights of property, and freedom of speech.
That's not defining it. That's just characterizing it.
Is he literally knew like what Milo was saying? Like
it's a laundry list of things.
Like the British Constitution is in like the British. The body of the British spirit?
Means the vibe.
Dicey's vibes of the British Constitution.
He means the vibe of the government being, like, cool.
No, but also, the British Constitution is like the baseball stadium in Field of Dreams. Like, the whole thing is like, if you build it, they will come. So it's like, it's just whatever you want it to be at that given moment.
Actually, slightly too many of them will come, and we have to do something about
it. For the Victorians and us, this constitution led to a stable and prosperous state.
No, it didn't.
From that bedrock, the conditions of the people were improved for the Victorians and continue to improve now.
No.
Nope. So it's from this little.
I know we're not doing the like we're critiquing his history stuff because it's all going to be like this and it's all going to be so bad. But it's like it's worth remembering that right now, fucking Horrible Histories, a show for children, is an enemy of the state for suggesting that maybe some of the things that the Victorians did were bad in the gentlest way.
I, of course, have no comment on that story.
However, we brought in Lawrence Fox.
I couldn't possibly comment on that, given that apparently even just introducing it makes me anti-British and against the values of the country. But yes, it is. It does make it's been an interesting weekend as we record off the back of the Victorian sketch from the Horrible Histories thing. It does show you the level of sensitivity that people have about even the mildest critique of, robust debate and freedom of speech are one of the things that are apparently in Jacob Rees-Mogg's imaginary British Constitution. But if you...
But it's robust debate about what kind of phrenology is good.
Or it's robust debate about things that are so abstract, like, what does good taste like or whatever. It just it's pointless. But this is
what
actually...
What should Nanny make for dinner?
From the position of it's just the starting point that Jacob Rees-Mogg actually has no internal life. Like, he's not fully he's
an NPC.
He's a husk. From that starting point,
he's a townsperson who gives you a task in an RPG.
Can we come to that later? Minecraft villager noise.
We come to that later because we do think of that, but not quite in that way. So, but from that position, the view of a honey-cheeked prelapsarian Victorian time where you didn't have to wrestle with people objecting to you doing what you do must seem very seductive. And it's a very personal connection to something immaterial that Jacob Rees-Mogg is yearning for. He's writing himself a happy place. And so when people when people who have that same thing as their happy place, people who feel that desperate need to connect with something bigger than them, see their nostalgic vision of what the world was like attacked, they take it very, very personally.
Yeah, sure.
And the problem is that nostalgic vision isn't just a personal preference about how they'd like to think of the country. It results in a lot of fascism.
Yeah, it's not just aesthetic. They don't just want the stovepipe hats, right?
Yeah. We forget what comes under the stovepipe hat.
An even smaller stovepipe hat.
And within that stovepipe hat, a set of phrenology calipers.
So, for the sake of my own Twitter feed, all I'll say is you lot are a bunch of anti-British assholes and you're trying to brainwash children. Okay?
Nish, you know what? That actually is deft diplomacy, unlike whatever bullshit he's going to say about Palmerston.
So, we also have to remember, like, all pieces of critical writing, and this is criticizing, it's just criticizing criticism, who is Jacob Rees-Mogg writing against? Because a critical piece of writing always has to defend a position. And this piece of writing is basically critical against critics who would consider, like, Year 5 history to be overly complex critical theory designed to undermine the legacy of Lord Palmerston.
Who criticizes the critics?
Which is personified in Lytton Strachey throughout the book, this early 20th century Bloomsbury Group member. So, everything's fine. Don't include my imaginary nostalgia, which I've cultivated in order to feel less empty. So, this is wrapping up the introduction. The British today have even more opportunity than the Victorians did to be successful.
That is just a Tumblr joke. If I fed a medieval woman even one of my sour M&Ms, she would die.
Yeah. If we cannot share their inner belief and self-confidence that propelled the Victorians, we will stand still, petrified as other nations overtake us.
Dude, it's a little bit late for that, don't you think?
Margaret Thatcher showed how the new Victorian spirit can work and reinvigorate a failing nation.
What?
Yeah. It's
the Victorians hated coal mining. They couldn't stand it.
This book was written for a world in which the Suez crisis worked out quite differently, I think.
It's weird to me because I was just thinking about this. I remember there was a story in the news, kind of apropos of nothing here, but they found a skeleton somewhere near like Limehouse, and it was from like the early Middle Ages. And this person had way, way, way better teeth than like most bodies they found from the Victorian era, because it fucking sucked, because like people had, it was actually got worse here, like for your average person's quality of life.
The glory was up. Glory was off the charts.
That's also true of like general hygiene. Like if you read Eleanor Herman's Royal Art of Poison, there's a long section in there about how for years during the medieval and early modern periods, aristocrats had worse healthcare because they were just pouring gold and stuff into themselves, while peasants were like using herbs and things, because that's what you could find.
Exactly,
so,
yeah.
Since Thatcher left office, the forces of stagnation, trepidation, and hesitation have returned. These heroes of old who possessed belief in patriotism, a sense of duty, and a confidence in progress and knowledge of civilization.
Wait, so Margaret Thatcher is an honorary Victorian now? That's where this book has gone already.
Yes. Okay. One big cursed stovepipe hat.
What the fuck is he on about?
Well, it's that Margaret Thatcher did Thatcherism, which is where you flog off all of the like state-owned resources to like private companies, which in a sense is kind of what Queen Victoria did. when you think about it, and if you've been inhaling smoke for a while.
It's like you do need a carbon monoxide detector, just in case.
Yeah. There's a graph between, kind of the economy, but not defined as to what that means going up, and also like amount of table legs covered for the sake of decency. Yeah.
Well, the thing is, right, you have to remember that this only makes sense if you view it as Jacob Rees-Mogg yearning for meaning and connection, because that's what this is. This is the connection of my personal acquisitiveness to these sort of sets of policies that benefit me and 4 other people that have been directly connected to the vigor, spirit, and moral worth of us as a national group.
Yes, it has to mean something, and it has to be for the benefit of a nation that still exists. And like, if Britain has changed in some ways since the fucking Victorian values with which I was inculcated while like worrying about showing the Latin master too much leg, then what am I to do but to try and drag us back to it by writing a fucking polemic?
So wait, what he's saying is that nothing of value, including fighting a war against fascism, setting up the welfare state and the National Health Service, nothing of any value happened between the Victorians and Margaret Thatcher.
I mean, he's heavily implying it.
So basically, between 1901 and 1979 is a dead zone.
Oh, sorry.
He never speak of.
He says that the Victorian period lasted from about 1790 until about like 1920.
Right, okay.
You know who was cucked was Winston Churchill, right?
It was until women got the vote and started wearing those short dresses. That was when everything went downhill.
So what we say is, the other thing is, like, this is a fusing of Victorian ideology and Victorian morals and aesthetics with neoliberalism. But he finishes the paragraph. This is the end of the introduction. In they're proving like all these modern trepidatious people wrong. He says, even if the Lytton Strachys of the world disbelieve and mock them, he was wrong.
So 2 questions for you.
Owned.
So when that segue into Margaret Thatcher, did you edit that, like there was interspersing text, or was that legitimately how that paragraph
Did you edit out the sentence, I'm about to talk some absolute horse shit?
No, that just...
When we put the notes for this together, Riley and I edited this together, and one of the decisions we made early on was that we were not going to abridge Jacob Rees-Mogg at all, because this is just how he writes.
Because I'm just like, I realized your comment previously that there's sort of like the purview of liberal journalists to make fun of the bad history, but like this is terrible writing, and it's a weird conundrum when somebody has gotten to this like Sun King position in British politics that like no editor is allowed to change their prose because that's Marxism for some reason. What the hell is
I'm
this?
excited for like the future descendant of Jacob Rees-Mogg in 110 years time, who will be forced to like quote tweet all of my own tweets, being like, "Ha, owned."
Well, yeah, because we edited very, very little, if anything. This is just how he writes.
It was about picking the paragraphs, not the words within the paragraphs. So here's also our thesis within his thesis. Jacob Rees-Mogg has to be understood as playing World of Warcraft. Queen Victoria has been reborn as Margaret Thatcher and has given him the main quest, which is to make Britain good. The British proletariat are by and large friendly NPCs, some of whom might give you quests, most of them just walk around. The other factions players are Lytton Strachey and then...
Because that's PvP.
Yeah, it's PvP with Lytton Strachey. And then the non-Western proletariat are like random encounters you have to grind for rep with the East India Company or Raytheon or whatever. So it's like, bring me 9 thuggy belts for a new musket enchantment.
Yeah, because he has no like internal life, right? He can't... We're talking about psychopath shit. He can't picture other people as having like their own thoughts or personalities. So of course they're just mobs.
Because even for someone of Jacob Rees-Mogg's politics, like to sort of essentially even erase, even Churchill seems to have been like too much for this dude.
Well,
like
look, we've only done a few of the biographies. Maybe Churchill is referenced in some of the other ones. I believe he's quoted a few times.
Right.
But he's really...
You've got to feel like Churchill. Even Rees-Mogg must like Churchill.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, he does.
Like,
he's
like the one Victorian who like dragged us through our soy war.
Yeah, right. Yes, that's how he...
Well, don't forget Churchill was a Victorian.
So let's start... Yeah, because being Victorian's about a vibe, and Britain used to have that vibe, and then Churchill had that vibe, Thatcher had that vibe, and if we do Brexit, we'll all have that vibe. Well, we're doing Brexit, but we'll have that vibe more.
Then why write a book about the Victorians if the center point of your thesis is that you can be a Victorian by being Margaret Thatcher, then why just write about Thatcher?
Because he wants to connect neoliberalism to some kind of British identity that's deeply rooted in history. That's why.
Exactly.
He's just very, very stupid.
He wants it to be an Agatha Christie novel about why the housing market should only enrich one guy.
Yes. So let's start the first biography. This is a quick hit because it's so long. We're going to skip through a few of them, but then we're going to go deep into a couple.
Yeah.
So, Robert Peel. By 1828, Robert Peel was ready to set about massive police reform in London, and in these pre-Victorian years, he laid suitably moral foundations for the Metropolitan Police, the first truly Victorian organization.
And which never had any problems ever again.
He says massive police reform, but the police just didn't exist before
just
Robert Peel.
Well, what is that if not the biggest reform of all?
A reform from the opposite of police to police.
Chapter 1, page 1, 72-point font, cop zone.
He sought for his new police force men of the utmost probity, and he saw to it that they would not be tempted by outside blandishments or financial gain. And what's crucial...
Fuck off with the word blandishment.
And what's crucial is that Jacob Rees-Mogg doesn't say how he went about doing that. He just reassures us that he did.
You know who has never been bribed by anyone ever as a Met police officer?
No. Yeah. Certainly not one in the Victorian era. But they were all just... Well, their hats were too tall for them to be bribes.
It absolutely never happened that, a series of cartoonish villains were, robbing a bank and then presented a constable with, a helping Christmas ham and would, be waved on their way.
So what he thinks, though, is that the police force would have been tempted, but we needed Robert Peel to come in and do morality to it. So, to understand Peel, Jacob Rees-Mogg continues to say, and the age he brought into being, yo, what's up?
Again, he's not defining any of these things. This is worse than Wikipedia.
In 1828, Robert Peel invented cops. And then we learned about being good, because if you're not being good, then the cops are bad.
So, without Robert Peel, you couldn't have had the TV show Cops, which is very fun.
I would totally watch Victorian cops, though. Victorian road wars.
To understand Peel and the age he brought into being is to appreciate that, and can we get a little ding every time I say Victorian in the next paragraph?
Okay, fine.
Is to appreciate that pivotal Victorian virtue of respectability. There are any number of other Victorian exemplars. Such men showed just what was industriously possible. Victorian values was not a slogan of a century to come, but a real scheme of morals which sought to improve, sustain, and care for the community as a whole, and in a hard-headed fashion, to boot.
To boot?
You gotta hit the word count, guys.
You've got to do it.
It's like when I was writing essays.
That is the most Victorian thing, though.
Yeah, it's when I used to write essays
by the word.
Yeah.
Just keep restating the title.
Screw Flanders.
Yeah, screw Flanders. Yeah.
If it's a code of values, then can we have it codified, please? No. And secondly, this makes
Principal Skinner.
The level of just straight up determinism here. This makes Hansel and Gretel look like a fucking postmodern novel. I mean, I just hearing this stuff. I've never heard something this simplistic.
You know what's really funny though is that Peel did try to codify his own values. The principles of policing was something he came up with, and Jacob Rees-Mogg just doesn't bother to
does not cite that.
No.
Because it wasn't a runaway success as he would define it, so he just doesn't make it into the book for some reason.
Damn, I hate it when being good is hard.
Yeah.
Also, Victorian values was not the slogan of a century to come, but a real scheme of morals which sought to improve, sustain, and care for a community as a whole, and in a hard-headed fashion to boot. All good history writing includes the phrase to boot.
Yeah. If there's one thing I want from history, it's boot.
Yeah, exactly.
And if there's one thing that I take away from my knowledge of the Victorians, it's bringing up the community together with a spirit of community involvement. It's
Victorian community was the community for Victorians among Victorians in that community.
Yeah, exactly.
This podcast recorded in Whitechapel, a place where the Metropolitan Police famously uplifted and it showed great moral probity.
Lots of local Victorian industrialists would do good things for the community, like run youth activities for young people where they could come and learn to use a steam loom and climb into the narrow spaces of the the steam loom
also,
to dangerously
all of Charles
retrieve
Dickens'
things.
novels are famously about how equal everyone was.
Yeah, exactly.
So Jacob Rees-Mogg sees the task of the historian here as defending the Metropolitan Police as a fundamentally good institution, and if you're criticizing it, then you're Littenstracky.
On the one hand, like the image of like rowing out onto the sea of ignorance and like rescuing individual things to like carefully consider them, and on the other, the cops is good.
So, Lord Palmerston.
Lord Palmerston.
Hit the elder.
It's so funny that there is just a like decades worth of a generation that only associates Lord Palmerston with Barney's drunken bar fight.
So, this is my favorite line from the entire book. This is my favorite line. In February 1855, Palmerston at last attained the greatest office of all with his appointment as Prime Minister. Yep.
Damn.
In the politics game, there's only one big boy at the top spot. Everyone's talking about it. Who's the Prime Minister?
In the Super Bowl of politics, there's one quarterback, and that quarterback's name, the President.
Yeah. Well, to be fair, there was one other top spot, which was called Being Queen Victoria. But that one had already been snapped up by another hot young property known as Queen Victoria.
She has a biography in this towards the end.
Oh, incredible.
We don't talk about it today.
The greatest Victorian of all.
Yeah, the titular
only woman.
Victorian.
So good, the only woman.
So good they named her after the Victorian era. The woman who came to signify the Victorian era, Queen Victoria.
I legitimately feel like that guy who eats old rations on YouTube and ate the fucking potted meat from the Victorian era learned more about the Victorian era than anyone who reads this book would.
I really feel Steve MRE info is being piloted by Victorian gut parasites right now.
I really feel like
he's the only living Victorian.
The last line of this book is surely and truly the Victorians were in us all along. That's it.
So, Palmerston rejected ideologically dogmatic excesses, dismissing, for example, the idea that cholera was an act of God that could be halted by penitential fasting. Instead,
that's not an ideologically dogmatic excess, that's just being dumb.
Instead, he pressed publicly the idea that civics works in the poorest areas were the best way to stop diseases which led to death. And here's how Jacob Rees-Mogg sort of puts this together into a narrative. He says, in other words, his work in government was connected with his Edinburgh philosophic apprenticeship and enabled to bring his intelligence and learning to bear for the good of the people.
Wait, because otherwise he'd have to admit that spending money on public infrastructure stops poor people from dying.
No, it's that he says, Jacob Rees-Mogg's argument is that because Lord Palmerston spent several years at the University of Edinburgh, which was like the center of the Scottish Enlightenment at the time, which was all about like reason and science and so on, that Lord Palmerston was able to use A-B reasoning.
Yes, Scotland invented thinking. Before that, nobody there wasn't even thinking one back then, let alone thinking two.
So this is because like the historian's job, we go back, is to try and draw together a story to bring up insights from the sea of your subject. And he said, I bet I know where Lord Palmerston learned how to think. It was Edinburgh, the place that came up with it.
I like how when Lord Palmerston suggests like maybe not making all the sewers open to stop people dying of cholera, it's like good, it's king shit because it was Victorian. But when someone suggests taking the highly flammable cladding off of the council blocks, that's dumb guy shit.
That's because you're not a philosopher king about it.
Yeah.
If you'd gone to the University of Edinburgh and come back learning how to think and then thought wisely that it would be good to aliment the poor and uplift them by not having them be on fire, then, that would be good.
I've done 13 Edinburgh festivals. Does that mean I can now tell Jacob Rees-Mogg to stop being such a cunt?
So this should also remind you a bit of Steven Pinker, because the old Palmerston's 2 years he spent in Edinburgh are used as the root cause of his ability to use evidence to solve problems. But now we're going to go to General Sir Charles Napier, the conqueror of Sind.
Friend of the show.
So, everyone do grasp onto something, because if you thought that thing about the police where he was like, he made sure none of them were bad, check out this next paragraph.
Chapter 2, page 1, 72-point font, Troop Zone.
In the aftermath of the British victory, Hyderabad opened its gates and Napier gallantly returned to the emirs the jeweled swords they had ceremonially surrendered to him in token of defeat. awful sentence.
That was nice of him, I guess.
He further ensured that Sindhi women were guarded and went unmolested. And indeed, when the editor of the Bombay Times claimed that they were systematically violated by the army, all 104 of Napier's officers who survived the battle immediately signed a letter promising they didn't.
Well, I have no further questions.
My God.
I've never... Oh, this is amazing. This is like a 10 out of 10. Like, no, actually, all the officers were in Pizza Express. I don't know what you're talking about.
It's very convenient to stay in Hyderabad.
Yeah.
Indeed, it's very convenient.
This is the next sentence. Sorry, he said, signed a letter refuting this, was what he said. For Napier believed in the moral force of intervention and of intervention with honor. Because that causal word for starting the sentence absolutely follows from that previous line.
Intervention with honor is when you invade somebody's country, but you don't like molest their women. Or you do, but you say you don't.
You promise you didn't.
Yeah. Intervention with honor sounds like a Tom Clancy novel.
Yeah. You say that if it were to have been done, then it would have been bad.
Yes.
That is the...
But it didn't happen. We've established that. And how do we know? Because some guys all said it didn't.
This is
exactly.
Johnny Cochran shit.
Can I also say that, like, obviously the reason why Jacob Rees-Mogg loves Charles Napier is that Charles Napier did the most Jacob Rees-Mogg thing of all time,
which is fucking Latin pun.
Yes, when he conquered Sind, the message he sent to London to the fucking top brass was peccavi, which is the Latin past participle of fucking, which means I have sinned. Yeah. So it's like a Latin pun.
Fucking hell.
Yeah. And that's the kind of shit Jacob Rees-Mogg would literally do now.
Oh, that is insult to injury.
I mean, you wouldn't be smart enough to do that now.
Ancestors conquered by a nerd, Nish.
Yeah,
I'm sorry to say it.
He would say it, but he'd say peccavi.
Yeah,
it's a repeated refrain of the great British comedian Ahir Shah, but can you believe our ancestors were conquered by someone a generation so lame?
Yeah, he was like peccavi, and then when they were like, "Did your officers kind of molest all these women?" and he's like, non-peccavi.
Part of the problem with that is that Latin doesn't have a distinct word for no exactly.
Yeah,
so we had to have this long signatured letter.
Yeah,
Jesus Christ, that is fucking horrific.
Yeah. So, again, it's just the whole, like, well, there's all of these sources that say the thing I don't like, but then the thing that makes me just feel good about this grand national project in all of the forms it has taken, whether the neoliberal one or the imperial one, is morally upright. And speaking of...
Well, if the letter is writ, you must acquit.
He gave the important people their swords back, and that means that he was gallant.
Yeah.
Awful.
So, Napier's quest was to pull Sind out of the feudalism he saw as being responsible for the starvation and squalor, which was visible to every British official.
No. Barbershop quartet from Trash Future.
Specifically, his plan was to encourage local notables to reject their previous role as armed chieftains and embrace a new role as improving resident landlords.
He was Pete Buttigieg of the 19th century. He tried to McKinsey Sind.
So, here, Napier's relative lack of experience told with negative consequences for his policy of moral intervention, because basically he just magicked into existence a bunch of incredibly extractive, abusive landlords by doing what he did to Ireland, which did the same thing there.
Pete fucking Buttigieg rides again before his day.
He basically was like, we know how we can improve the lives of people and bring them out from under squalor. Let's do here what Britain did to Ireland.
Oh, Christ.
I assume that'll be fine. But here's why that's actually okay, Nish, and why you're being unfair. Why
I hate Britain.
Sorry, you're being a bit of a lit and strikey right now.
Yeah.
Because, as Jacob Rees-Mogg says, even though it didn't work, Napier's intentions were always good.
Remember, if ever you're looking in the mirror and you're being very lit and straighty on yourself, try and give yourself a little bit of Jacob Rees-Mogg too.
So he fucked up and he killed a lot of people, but he was pure of heart, was the thing.
Well, he was also brave and fair, like the maidens of old.
Oh, damn.
Okay.
He opposed evil practices as well, such as sati.
What if he had opposed evil practices and his intentions were good, but also he was a massive coward? Just out of curiosity.
He opposed evil practices in every sense except the one sense of not doing them.
He deserved...
I oppose this, he said.
That's the least important sense.
Also, by the way, Napier's intentions were always good. Good, another word that is just not being defined throughout this entire book. That's what, again, good academic history writing should use the word good liberally.
Well, good means you were wearing a bow tie at the time,
Well, no,
right?
good means good and bad means bad, and people have forgotten that.
Mm.
But like you say, this is like primary school. Like if you wrote an essay in primary school saying the past is bad, your teacher would be like, come on, mate. I know you're 8 years old and you literally just stopped shitting your pants, but let's try and elevate a little bit beyond the past was
This is
good.
what happens when you have a nanny forever. Napier deserves his place in the pantheon of heroes.
Definitely
What
the
the
original
fuck
title
is
of his
that?
book. Definitely what he was
Is
going
that
to
a
call it.
Percy Jackson book?
That thing that Jacob Rees-Mogg would like us to have.
Fash to me. Like, maybe?
Damn.
But that does not mean everything he tried succeeded. If there was no standard, there would be no heroes.
Avengers East India game.
So, and the historical point about this, we've made, but the psychoanalytic point is that Rees-Mogg is inventing a fantasy in which his own intentions...
I can still be a hero. I can still be a hero. I can still be a hero. I have fucked up everything, but my intentions are good, and that's heroic.
Well, and if you combine two very important qualities of Napier that are the ones he pulls out, which is that intentions are all that ever matter, and the best way to actually make people's lives better is to be an improving landlord. So this is basically just, the more my hedge fund owns, the better the world gets.
Fucking hell.
This is the big one.
Uh-oh.
This is the big boy we're coming to next. William Suleiman.
Uh-oh.
Chapter 3, page 1, 72-point font, cop troop zone.
So this is from Jacob Rees-Mogg's introduction to the piece. And don't worry, we're going to define all of these terms as we go through.
He's certainly fucking not.
Thuggy did not exist, and it never existed. No, it was merely the product of lurid Victorian Orientalist sensationalism.
Ooh!
This is the Spectator article phenomenon, isn't it?
Where he's saying the right thing for the first paragraph.
Yeah.
Because we'll get to what Thuggy is in a bit. Because it's true, it was the product of the Victorians being lurid Orientalist sensationalists.
Which is definitely the bit about the Victorians that Jacob Rees-Mogg doesn't like.
So he continues.
In case you hadn't gotten that from the previous bits.
In defining what Orientalist means, he says the Western Orientalists were capable of all kinds of wickedness in the form of tales, stories, and accounts, their intent being to criticize and patronize Eastern civilizations, to diminish them in the eyes of Western readers and consumers, and in so doing to justify Western predation, exploitation, settlement, and theft of their land and assets.
Okay,
hence,
so
justify the things that I've already said are good.
Hold on a second, though.
Thuggy was a concept that had to be dreamed up because Indian civilization had to be labeled as violent, murderous, and beyond the pale.
That's why beyond the pale is a good word there, because that was applied to colonialism in Ireland, the pale being the pale of settlement around Dublin, beyond which English law did not apply, and you could just do whatever. Anyway, clearly, this is the important bit to me, because it means that he understands how bad faith this is. Like, all of the primary school history stuff, whatever, fine. But, he's not stupid. He's just summarized in a sort of arch-ironic tone what Orientalism is, and he's right about it, which means he knows what he's doing in this next bit that's coming up, where I'm sure he just takes a giant shit on the whole concept.
Oh, Christ.
So, he could have stopped here.
Yeah.
But
fine.
then how would this great book have been written?
All absolutely fine. What an interesting thing to have written. Go ahead. I see no reason to assume this will not continue in the same vein.
Thus runs the prevailing academic approach to the phenomenon of Thuggy and its untold thousands of victims.
Put forward by certain people from the early 20th century, who I won't name.
Why are the victims untold? Just told them. At least people on Twitter will be like, Stalin killed 11 trillion people. That's...
Told. So, why lift a finger or a pen to combat the actions of such murderers and villains when one could instead avert one's eye and rationalize them out of existence? So that whole thing we said about Victorian Orientalists up at the top, we're not doing that.
That's why this is so cynical, right? Is that he included that first part. He didn't need to. He could have just gone with, this thing was real and it was bad and it killed 11 trillion people. But instead he had to have this little aside to get his dig in at Lytton Strachey and whoever else. And it just shows how false and how venomous this whole book and person is.
Yeah. And also the whole thing is he says, okay, his argument here is just ignore the first stuff about how people invent insane stories to justify imperialism, because ignoring the insaneness of the story that we're about to tell to justify imperialism, you're the real racist. What if the Thuggee killed 1 billion Indians?
Okay,
You'd feel pretty bad then.
What the fuck?
So what was Thuggee? I'm going to go now. Nate, I know you know, so I'm going to start with Milo. What do you think Thuggee was?
A kind of a very early Indian SoundCloud rapper.
Are you doing the startup round with Thuggee?
Yes. Nish, what do you think Thuggee was?
Well, I'm assuming it's going to be a not particularly complimentary depiction of one of my forefathers.
Sort of.
Yeah.
It is, the Thuggee were seen as they were a murder cult that existed up and down all of wherever the British wanted to go take stuff, coincidentally.
What a coincidence.
And the way to understand it is it's essentially the knockout game. It's pure knockout game stuff, where it's you make up a myth that the people you want to police are doing, and then you say, well, they're doing it, and if you don't believe they're doing it, then you must hate them.
Right.
So this is from other sources. In the 1820s, Captain William Sleeman had made the first discoveries of strangled travelers in shallow graves around Madras. And his just dry reports of these things ended up being sensationalized and exaggerated to create a moral panic all around the English-speaking world about a murder cult in India called the Thuggee.
Yeah, because you can't, like, rob and murder people for reasons other than cults. Especially if you have whatever phrenological configuration we've decided.
It's a melanin thing.
As we know,
these guys can see my skull shape.
Yeah.
I'm moments away from forming a cult.
Wait, the British Empire was a cult?
So James Sleeman, writing about his grandfather in the late Victorian period, described the Thuggee thusly. The taking of human life for the sheer lust of killing was their main object. The plunder, however pleasant, being a secondary consideration.
They just love killing so much.
Here was no body of amateur assassins driven to crime by force of circumstance, but men of seeming respectability and high intelligence, often occupying positions of importance and responsibility in normal lives, secretly trained from boyhood in the highest degree of skill in strangulation.
They were doing Assassin's Creed
Tier 1
shit.
strangling
So
operation.
basically, Britain, a country that famous for fucking highwayman robberies, thinks that in India they rob people not because they want money, but rather because they're all part of a ninja cult.
So
My name was Captain Kidd. God's laws.
They do they have kids throwing fucking ninja stars and climbing rope ladders when they're 5, not to take money, but just for the love of the sport.
So,
So basically, it's fox hunting, but for people.
So this is the real history of it, or as close as we can summarize, which is that this is just disparate populations of, as you said, Nate, bandits and highwaymen pushed to crime frequently as gangs of demobilized mercenaries who were made necessary by British destabilization of the region as they fostered internecine war between emirs and maharajas and stuff. Think of them as like the Indian condottieri. And there emerged this myth of a sacrificing cult of murderers devoted to the killing of travelers as a ritual to appease Kali, necessitating ever more British law, which, by the way, is good. And that's where we get the word thug.
Fucking hell.
Love to murder to appease my strange exotic goddess or whatever.
So, keeping an eye on the time, I'm going to talk Sleeman. William Sleeman, Jacob Rees-Mogg writes, was almost a prototype Victorian. So almost a prototype Victorian. So we know what this means.
Pre-prototype.
Well, yeah, it's like, well, he's a prototype Victorian, so we know what that means, obviously. Don't even need to say it.
He's like a back of a fag packet drawing of an idea for a Victorian.
Well, he's almost that.
Yeah.
So his success exemplified that great, if unsung, Victorian virtue of sound, strong administration.
No, that was to be sung.
No, here we go. Hold on. This is another one of my favorite lines. It shows this was a first draft. A great, if unsung, Victorian virtue of sound, strong administration. Indeed, he was a classic administrator.
What?
Those two sentences both go together.
This is like if you just took the fucking the music off of HMS Pinafore or something, right? It's like he's very modern major administrator.
Well, no, it's like it's got choruses.
Yeah.
The tasks he accomplished would stay accomplished.
Jesus Christ.
And stay accomplished.
The Thuggees
The
seem to no longer have been murdering people.
song.
This is what would have happened if Hamilton had been written by white people.
Yeah.
So it's like the Thuggee are no longer murdering people. We've gone back to good old British gangs of bandits. This is the very idea of being a good Victorian. So he was a good Victorian administrator, inasmuch as his job was to administrate in Victorian times, and boy was he good at it. How fortunate, and this is Jacob Rees-Mogg again, how fortunate, how providential that such a man was on hand in the subcontinent to take a look at India in the round and to identify precisely those aspects of its life and character that must change.
Look at India in the round.
God. And that's where he gets to the thuggy.
He was a McKinsey consultant once again. He identified externalities such as the stranglings and right-sized them.
So
Cool.
here's another really good bit of history writing. We're gonna do a little bell when we have the best words in any history book come in. Sleeman's part in encountering and then exterminating the thuggy came about by chance. He happened to be on the spot when several incidents occurred. History bell here. On the other hand, perhaps fate or destiny had ordained precisely that Sleeman be on that spot.
What?
Fate, destiny, these historical concepts. Again, concepts that make sense if you're writing to yourself to fill yourself with a purpose that's been robbed from you by your sociopathic father. But concepts that don't make sense in the context of an academic history book.
Oh, that is superb.
For it needed such a man as he to deal with a situation that so many before him had failed to resolve. Anyway, I love to write a history book that includes the phrase perhaps fate or destiny. Our apologize to friend of the show, Eleanor Yannicka. I'm sure you've torn out your AirPods at this point.
I love to show up in a country and just start a load of murdering and then be like, damn, someone's got to do something about all this murdering.
Oh my God.
It is very similar to planting a gun on somebody, right?
Planting the thuggy.
Yeah.
So he says, they were noted at the time as being closely shaved and oiled all over so that if caught, they could slip under
just like my friends on the cricket team.
Truly the original smooth criminal.
Fellas, is it gay to be smoothly oiled all over?
So, if you believe, so he says, remember, the first thing he says, it's Orientalist not to believe, it's not Orientalist, it's racist against Indians because you don't care about them to not believe everything you hear about the thuggy. And so that means that if you're not a real racist, you therefore have to believe that there was a cadre of shaved, oiled, and mostly nude men running around India strangling each other.
Oh my God, it's like Mountain Blade. They're just getting robbed by naked guys. He basically taken prisoner by oil.
It sounded like that setup in the initial paragraphs you read was to suggest that you are blaming the victim if you don't believe this mythology.
You're not respecting Indians' agency.
You're trying to rationalize away all this bad stuff that's happening.
Can we please believe women? I'm defining women as the British Army.
So they also exploited what many observers recognized as a weakness implicit in Indian society as a result of the governance of the East India Company, because the subcontinent was split between regions ruled directly by the company and native states under varying degrees of British sway and regulation, and so law and order there tended to be fragmented until Sleeman took an interest.
So this they're willing to nationalize.
The authorities
I'm just surprised he mentioned the East India Company at all, right?
He does not mention it again.
Of course. But he calls the East India, he calls company rule a weakness implicit in Indian society. And not a weakness implicit in British colonial administration.
I absolutely love that effectively the opening of that paragraph is racism is bad, said the loser, who actually was the real racist.
Until Sleeman took an interest, the authorities were aware that something was happening on India's roads, something criminal and murderous, but had no conception that a plethora of individual incidents were part of a greater malignant whole. Probably because they weren't.
Yeah.
Aware of the unwillingness in many quarters to open up the vistas of this appalling case, Sleeman wrote an anonymous article and sent it to the Calcutta Literary Gazette.
He was a narc and a writer to a newspaper.
No, he was Q.
Oh, damn.
The article detailed the material on the thuggy, which so far had been accumulated, even if in its slenderness was ghastly enough.
Wait, he started QAnon, but in India?
Yes. Many Victorians' great works were underpinned by having a strong and energetic press willing them on in their endeavors and able to support their works. So that's a little hat tip to the Daily Telegraph there, saying, thanks for Brexit. So, archaic Mughal provisions meant that prisoners' words could not be used against other prisoners. Sleeman
hold on a second. So, having a right against, hearsay is archaic when it's Mughal, but when it's British, it's part of our incredible constitution, which has been so widely copied.
Well, Alice, this was swept away because central to Sleeman's scheme to deal with the thuggy were thugs who turned informer.
Oh, good.
So basically, gonna wear a wire.
So basically,
it's hard because it kept slipping off them.
Archaic human rights law. And a society that develops a human rights law that I then deem as archaic after I overthrow it. That doesn't mean that it wasn't primitive. If anything, it means it was too primitive.
Yeah. So the situation is, if Captain Sleeman catches you and says you're in a murder cult, you can avoid getting executed by saying some other guy was in a murder cult.
Name 5 friends.
Well, it's a pyramid scheme.
Yeah.
That's how the murder cult got so big. It's just Herbalife, but the Indian version.
And again, here, Jacob, here's where it comes back round to where he goes to recognizing the sensationalism again, but doesn't connect the two strands. Thugs were, and also very first draft vibes, thugs were part of a delicious mystery to the Victorians. Full stop.
Love a delicious mystery.
Hold on. Thugs were part of a delicious mystery to the Victorians. Full stop. There was nothing the Victorians relished more than a delicious mystery.
No. Holy shit. This is like if E.L. James had written Poirot.
All the tastier for being revealed a safe distance away. Now, that's not even the worst sentence in this paragraph.
I helped edit this and I don't believe you. My brain has purged this memory already.
The word tastier really hits the ear poorly.
We keep the recipe metaphor going. Add to the list of ingredients a dash of the cult of Kali. Oh! This is a kid's fight. This is the essay from the episode of The Simpsons where Lisa has to read an essay in Washington, where the girl's like, "How do you make America? Take 2 parts freedom and add a dash of stick to it."
It's like that. It's like fucking somebody watched Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, the worst Indiana Jones movie, like with a gas leak in their house.
Listen, the Cult of Kali, though, phenomenal name for an all-Indian punk band.
So, here was a crime, stupendous in scale, incomprehensible in its motivations and form, and best of all, irresistibly easy to tell as a story.
Fucking hell.
And yet he struggled.
You don't put that together with the fact that this might have been sensationalized.
Incomprehensible in its motivations and form. And maybe because it's not real. God, none of these events seem to be connected at all. How are they connected?
That's just how devious the Indian mob was.
Damn. Was it none of them had ever met each other or talked to each other before?
They concealed all of their crimes as being like a series of unconnected robberies.
Every terror cell was one person.
So, mindful of time, we have one more section left, and this is Pugin. So Pugin was an architect, and we had a paragraph about Augustus Pugin as an architect, but it was so boring that we had to cut it.
That's the problem with all of this shit. Some of it is so badly written that it's just dull.
We can summarize.
Yeah, we're summarizing it.
Augustus Pugin is a tradcath. Like, he's one of those press-esque to go back accounts that posts pictures of churches and they're like, "Oh, isn't this great?" before all the Muslims got in. Except he also built buildings, most notably the clock tower that contains Big Ben.
Yeah,
right.
But then also a bunch of churches and stately homes that had Gothic buttresses. Like
press-esque, yes.
Yeah, so I think he had Southwark Cathedral was one of the most mediocre and forgettable cathedrals in London.
He built the world's first Eton Fives court.
There, done. Fuck you, JRM. So, he also wrote a book called Contrasts that was supposed to be a blueprint for a new and better society through flying buttresses. And the full title was Contrasts, or A Parallel Between the Noble Edifices of the 14th and 15th Centuries and Similar Buildings of the Present Day, Showing the Present Decay of Taste.
Okay, this is some Alan Partridge shit.
Well, no,
this is just the 19th century version of Lady Shapes with Alan Partridge.
Well, no, I'm saying is, do we have any guesses as to who the stand-in for Jacob Rees-Mogg in this book is yet?
It's not even Lady Shapes though. It is the press-esque to go back account. It is like the high Tory account that posts a Photoshop picture of some church in Poland and then a deliberately run down photo of a spa in Streatham.
And so you have to see Augustus Pugin as Jacob Rees-Mogg and Contrasts as this book. So he has written himself into his biography of eminent Victorians.
I'm telling you,
Amazing.
Winterbottom is going to make a dynamite film out of this. Coogan's going to play Rees-Mogg.
So, Contrast was handsomely and richly illustrated, but it was a classic polemic. It focused on a series of contemporary buildings, set them against a medieval equivalent, and supplied illustrations designed to magnify the beauty and harmony of one and to diminish the beauty of the other. Pugin's comparison of the newly built King's College London with a view of Christ Church, Oxford. The one hunches gracelessly between two larger buildings, while the other, its more contemporary Tom Tower edited out, is shown as the picture of grace.
This Twitter account still exists.
Contrast was above all a denunciation of urban life of the day. It attracted the world of the Regency, that Vanity Fair of stucco-fronted manners, high taste, and low principles.
But that's Jacob Rees-Mogg.
That's what Jacob Rees-Mogg likes, though.
Yeah.
He just likes nostalgia as an idea.
Yeah, it doesn't matter what it's nostalgic for. Jacob Rees-Mogg would like anything which for its time was nostalgic.
Yeah,
like a book written in like 600 AD that's like, I can't believe that they've stopped calling it Constantinople.
He is Homer Simpson with the little pennant that just says sports.
Contrast confronted the Britain that had, by means of its industrial revolution, created the modern world and squalor and misery in monstrous proportions such as the world had never previously seen. It claimed to be a work of rigorous impartiality, while simultaneously asserting that no fair mind could find favor in the work of the present century over the Middle Ages. Pugin's conclusion was that true buildings were the ones that emanated from the men who thoroughly imbued with devotion for and faith in the religion for whose worship they were erected.
Which is also a horrible sentence. So he couldn't
write
write either.
Piece of writing.
So that's a quote from Pugin, to be fair.
Oh, right, okay. Well, then he truly
Pugin
was the
also
Rees-Mogg
sucked,
of his day.
yes.
Wait, so
That's
hang on.
fucking
He
terrible.
writes this guy into his book, clearly as like a stand-in for him, but then also admits that this guy was completely wrong. He was like, oh yeah, this guy who is exactly like me, who was writing a book in the Victorian era, thought the Victorian era sucked and preferred an era.
He was just a weird simp for an earlier era because he wanted to feel good about himself. Anyway, he's me.
So here is how this works. Here's how this fits in.
Okay.
Pugin was also fated to be what could be called the first eclipsed Victorian, which is a category of thing.
Right.
Okay, are we going to define that one?
Victorians.
Even in his own lifetime, despite the very great architectural and cultural legacy, his people virtually lost sight of his achievement. He was the first victim of backlash, which began long before the Victorian age itself came to an end, against what Lytton Strachey...
He got owned by a guy who lived like 200 years after him. Awesome.
Against what Lytton Strachey's Bloomsbury contemporary Victoria Woolf called the Crystal Palaces, bassinets, military helmets, memorial wreaths, trousers, whiskers, and wedding cakes of the age. Everyone I don't like is Lytton.
This hero who was forgotten, even as the revolution he had uttered. It's me. I'm the guy.
And so that's the thing. It's also the world's first eclipsed Victorian, the first person who got cancelled by libs.
Damn.
The world's first owned Victorian.
The world's first cancelled.
The young Pugin was not alone in communing with an imagined past. The first decades of his life, in the age of modernity though they were, also witnessed a rising interest in interpreting and from time to time enacting history. This was the age of Romanticism, which reacted sharply to the mechanization and industrialization at work on all sides in multiple forms.
But
Jacob for the working class
is the mechanization and industrial. He's the beneficiary of all of this. He's a hedge fund guy.
Yeah, well, this is where he writes himself into the book as farce, because he recognizes that his nostalgia for imagined past is like, he's working to make the world a more mechanized and industrialized place. He's working to demolish all of this. It's just he has to console himself. But I continue. Take the Eglinton tournament of 1839, in which 100,000 spectators gathered in the pouring rain in Ayrshire to watch enactments of medieval jousts. Or Walter Scott's Ivanhoe, a romance which depicted a fanciful medieval world and became a bestseller. It was also the era of Young England, a group of youthful Tories at Eton and Cambridge invested in the idea of a medieval feudal golden age.
Well, this is exactly. Is this? I mean, I hate to give him any credit here, but is this some creeping self-awareness from Jacob Rees-Mogg?
No.
I can tell you that it's not because just like the last biography, there's an opportunity for self-awareness.
Yeah, sure.
That is dutifully avoided.
So, just like every problem can be an opportunity, every opportunity can also be a problem.
So this is the last of the quotes I'll read from Jacob Rees-Mogg's book, because we're going a bit long and I'm aware you've got to run. The shape he gave to his buildings, and this is the moral of the Augustus Pugin section.
Right.
The shape he gave to his buildings transferred to the shape that Britain herself assumed in the national psyche, which is, again, a meaningful sentence.
Yeah.
You know, the shape that Britain assumes in the national psyche is quite a bit like Southwark
Did you just
Cathedral.
assume my shape?
Well, no, it's quite a bit like the Southwark Cathedral.
Yeah, dismal, forgettable.
Lending his work a potency which none of his contemporaries can possibly match, Pugin took the language of the past and placed it in the service of the present, and in doing so he created marvels which affect our lives profoundly. If Churchill's famous quip, "We shape our buildings, thereafter they shape us," is to be believed.
This is like the exposition in a 50 Shades of Grey book. Like, what the fuck?
Yeah.
You know, it's also like, just sentences.
Why can none of these twats write? That's what
Yeah,
offends
they're
me
like
more than anything
impossibly
else.
expensively educated,
So
and yet
we're-
this is what they come up
Sorry,
with.
we're doing metropolitan elitism against Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Oh, no.
A sight of his life and work shows a man who could only ever have been what he was because he had a greater cause than himself.
A noble
Wow.
spirit embiggens the smallest man.
Jebediah Rees-Mogg.
Jebediah Rees-Mogg.
What's amazing
Fucking
is
hell.
also that bit where he was like that this guy is like a titan of our age. He's like shaped the world we live in today. Like, no one's ever heard of this guy.
Because of the libs.
Because of cancel
fucking
culture.
Straighty.
Because of Nish Kumar presenting a horrible history song.
So this is
He was
like, if
supposed
we're
to present
doing
the Oscars and they took it away from him.
if we're doing psychoanalysis, right, this is the fear that lingers in the heart of Jacob Rees-Mogg, is that like he is not going to be remembered, or will be remembered dismally, because the libs will get their way and will like wash away all of his beautiful, well-intentioned, mediocre work.
Fucking hell.
Trash Future survives, Jacob Rees-Mogg doesn't.
So yeah, and that means in 200 years there will be like the Jacob Rees-Mogg of his day will write a book about like eminent Brexiteers that will just constantly harp on this podcast.
Yes.
Anyway, I don't think that Milo would have done something like that.
The Trash Future set. And their comrades from Whitechapel.
All right. So that's the first half of this book.
Oh, good lord.
Can we arrange for Nish to get like reparations for having to read this?
Yeah, Nish will get 10% of the sales of this book, which is at the moment £4.
Oh man,
That is
okay.
absolute shit.
How do we all feel?
Sullied.
Yeah.
Like,
I feel like I just ate a pizza that was raw. I feel like I just ate, not even with meat. I'm not feeling sick from pepperoni, just that I've just spent the last hour and 16 minutes just chewing on uncooked pizza dough.
You know what I
I
think?
feel like Geralt of Rivia when like you drink a potion. I feel like I have high toxicity.
oh,
This,
God.
I think this episode will have made more money than Jacob Rees-Mogg's book has in sales.
And in that sense, we are doing upper class derision of Jacob Rees-Mogg.
I just, to be
Purely
honest,
on book sales, this
Yeah.
podcast is already ahead of his non-existent stupid fucking book.
More people will listen to this podcast about his book than ever
God.
bought his book.
Certainly more than listen to the audiobook of his book.
Oh, that is. I will not go there.
No.
I will do a lot for you people. I will not listen
I'll
to
do
that
almost
book.
anything for love.
So I believe it is now time to bring this sordid affair to not a real close, because we will be finishing this book at a later date, but to a temporary reprieve. So I want to first say, Nish, thank you so much for doing this to
Always
yourself
a
again.
pleasure. Always a word I'm using incorrectly, but it is always an experience.
And I'd like to thank you all for listening on our Patreon. You're all lovely, and I love and kiss each and every one of you. Do we want to do any plugs before we go? Nish, do you have anything coming up?
I've got nothing at the moment.
Yeah. like Nish's tweets on Twitter.
Yeah.
Go and watch horrible histories.
Do I have anything? I've got the shows at Vault Festival and at Leicester Comedy Festival and at the Melbourne International Comedy Festival. So check out. There'll be a link in the link in the description that goes to all of my. Well, I have a brain parasite. I'm sorry. Bing bong, Brexit, ding dong. Click on that and it'll give you all my tour dates if you want to come see me.
And also, we thank you for listening to this, for coming to our live inaugural TF Union debate tonight at the Head and Chickens. However, we're also doing a live show
on the 11th
of March. And that's going to be at Vauxhall Comedy Club. It's not going to be anything fancy. It's going to be a normal live show of this podcast. Mm-hmm. So please do come out to that. Mark it in your calendars. Tell your mom, tell your dad, tell your uncle. See if he can come. And I think with that, it's just left for me to say thank you all for listening. Thank you again, Nish, for coming on. And thank you to Ginseng for our theme song. Here we go. You can find it on Spotify. Listen to it early. Listen to it often. See you later.
Bye.
Bye.